The sound you're about to imagine isn't a gunshot or a scream. It's the slow, grinding scream of a drill biting into concrete, deep beneath London, while the city sleeps. On Easter weekend, when streets were empty and offices were dark, a group of men broke into what was supposed to be one of the safest vaults in Britain. Not young criminals. Not desperate amateurs. These were men old enough to be ignored, underestimated, and forgotten. And yet, by the time the sun rose, £14 million was already disappearing into the shadows. Welcome to Britain's Dark Files, a channel where we don't just tell you what happened, but why it mattered, and the details most stories leave out. Tonight, you're about to hear the story of the Hatton Garden heist, one of the most audacious crimes in UK history. But this isn't the version you've heard before. This is about arrogance, miscalculation, and the quiet belief that experience alone can erase consequences. So if you value deep, carefully told crime stories like this, take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who appreciates the darker truths behind real events. Hatton Garden wasn't just another street. It was the heart of London's Diamond District, a place built on trust, wealth, and the promise of absolute security. Beneath its pavement sat rows of safety deposit boxes holding lifetimes of savings, heirlooms, secrets, and fortunes that never appeared on paper. The vault was designed to withstand fire, force, and fear. What it wasn't designed to withstand was patience. Because the men targeting it weren't rushing. They weren't panicking. They believed time was on their side. And more dangerously, they believed that when it was all over, they could explain it away. Just another job, just another story, just another excuse. What they didn't realize was that every crime leaves behind something heavier than evidence. And once that weight settles in, no explanation is ever enough. They didn't look like criminals anymore. That was their greatest advantage. Gray hair, stiff movements, familiar routines, men who blended into the background of everyday London. To anyone passing them on the street, they were pensioners, grandfathers, men long past their dangerous years. But beneath that harmless surface lived decades of experience in burglary, fraud, and organized crime. These were not men chasing chaos. They were men chasing control. Each of them carried a past they rarely spoke about openly. Prison time had come and gone. Crews had formed and collapsed. Friends had disappeared into graves or obscurity. What remained was reputation, the kind earned quietly, through jobs done properly and silence kept afterward. In their own minds, they weren't thieves anymore. They were professionals. And professionals, they believed, don't make mistakes. Time had changed their bodies, but not their thinking. The city had modernized, security systems had evolved, yet the fundamentals were still there: routine, complacency, human error. They watched Hatton Garden the way hunters watch a trail, learning when lights went off, when alarms were ignored, when the street fell silent. They convinced themselves that nothing essential had changed, only the tools. The idea of one last job didn't arrive as desperation. It arrived as justification. A final score to secure comfort, to correct past losses, to prove, mostly to themselves, that they still had it. Age became part of the plan. Who would suspect them? Who would imagine men their age drilling through a vault wall? Trust bound them together, but it was fragile. Years of working alone had taught them to rely more on experience than on each other. Every man told himself a private story, that he was careful, smarter, different. That if things went wrong, it would be someone else's fault. And in those quiet explanations, the danger was already forming. Because when criminals believe they can define the rules, they stop respecting them. By the time Easter weekend approached, the plan felt less like a risk and more like a conclusion already written. All that remained was to carry it out, slowly, patiently, and with the confidence of men who believed history owed them a clean ending. Easter weekend arrived without ceremony. Offices closed early, streets emptied, and the rhythm of the city softened into something forgiving. For the men watching Hatton Garden, this wasn't a holiday, it was an opening. When they moved, they did so without urgency, carrying themselves like people who belonged wherever they stood. No disguises. No panic. Just quiet purpose. They entered through a lift shaft few ever thought about, descending into a space designed to be forgotten. The vault lay behind reinforced concrete, thick enough to discourage anyone who believed in speed. That was its mistake. The drill came out, heavy and unremarkable, and for hours the only sound underground was the steady grind of metal against stone. Progress was slow, exhausting, but measurable, and that was enough. Time lost its meaning down there. Dust filled the air, coating clothes, skin, lungs. Breaks were taken not out of fear, but fatigue. When the wall finally gave way, it wasn't dramatic. It was almost disappointing. Beyond it sat hundreds of safety deposit boxes, each one holding someone else's idea of security. They worked methodically, opening box after box, pausing only to rest their hands. Confidence grew with every success. They left and returned. They talked. They laughed. They began to believe the vault belonged to them. And that belief invited carelessness. Tools were set down without thought. Movements became routine. The urgency that should have crept in never did. Halfway through the story, it's worth pausing for a moment. If you're still watching, it means stories like this matter to you, not for the thrill, but for what they reveal about human nature. Supporting long-form crime storytelling keeps these details from being lost. By the final night, they walked away convinced they had beaten the system. The city above remained unaware, the alarms silent, the vault empty enough to feel victorious. What they couldn't see was that the evidence didn't need to chase them. It was already waiting, patient and permanent, ready to surface the moment someone started asking the wrong questions. The first cracks didn't appear with sirens or raids. They appeared quietly, in places the men had stopped thinking about. When staff returned after the holiday and discovered the breach, disbelief spread faster than panic. Investigators moved in not with urgency, but with patience. A crime like this wasn't solved by speed. It was solved by reconstruction. Every movement the men thought was invisible began to reappear in reverse. Cameras they assumed were dormant had been recording. Streets they believed were empty had been watching. Vehicles had passed through systems that never forgot. What looked like a perfect disappearance slowly reshaped itself into a map of decisions. Then there were the tools. Heavy equipment abandoned without concern, left behind like props after a performance. Each item told a story, where it had been bought, how it had been transported, who had handled it. The men had trusted routine more than caution, and routine had betrayed them. Phones became another loose thread. Brief calls. Familiar voices. Patterns that meant nothing in isolation but everything when aligned. Experience had taught them how to commit a burglary, but not how to exist in a world that recorded memory automatically. As arrests followed, a strange calm settled in. There were no dramatic chases, no public resistance. The explanations came instead, carefully shaped, incomplete, and self-protective. Each man tried to frame his role smaller than it was, less intentional, less knowing. Responsibility was diluted, shifted, softened. One figure remained elusive, spoken of more than seen. Basil lingered like a rumor, proof that even among professionals, secrets fracture trust. His absence unsettled the others, a reminder that control had slipped beyond reach. By the time sentences were handed down, the story felt finished on paper. But justice carried an emptiness. Not because punishment was absent, but because the men still believed, somewhere deep inside, that they had almost explained themselves out of the truth. And almost, in crimes like this, is never enough. What the court could never account for was the silence that followed. The sentences were written down, the headlines moved on, and the men grew older behind walls that finally held. But the money, most of it, never came back. Millions vanished into a space no investigation could fully illuminate. And in that absence, the story refused to end. Some believed the valuables were sold quietly, piece by piece, passed through hands that never asked questions. Others believed portions were hidden, waiting for someone patient enough to outlive suspicion. What mattered wasn't which theory was right, but what the missing money represented, proof that even when criminals are caught, control can still linger in the shadows. The men who drilled into Hatton Garden wanted to be remembered as masters of their craft. Instead, history reduced them to a contradiction, experienced enough to succeed, careless enough to fail. Their explanations never aligned with the weight of what they had done. Age didn't soften the crime. Experience didn't excuse it. And professionalism didn't erase the harm left behind. If you've stayed with this story to the end, you already understand why Britain's dark files exists. These cases aren't about spectacle, they're about what people tell themselves when they cross lines they can't return from. If you want to continue uncovering the truths that live beneath the headlines, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who looks beyond the surface. Because somewhere, in a drawer, a wall, or a memory no one will confess to, the last pieces of the Hatton Garden heist are still waiting. Not to be recovered, but to remind us that the most dangerous part of any crime isn't the act itself. It's the belief that, with the right explanation, it can ever be made acceptable.